I'd like to welcome everybody to the webinar today. My name is Ruth Callaghan. I'm an Associate Director with Strategic Communications firm Cannings. And today we've got a joint webinar that's looking at navigating issues around care through COVID-19. We're looking really at the post-COVID world and what some of the impacts are for the long-term care sector. Now, today I've got a couple of fantastic presenters that I'm going to introduce in a moment, but there are a few sectors that have obviously been as affected by the upheaval from coronavirus as the long-term care sector. And we know that worldwide, about half the deaths that have occurred from COVID-19 have actually occurred in that setting. So it's obviously an area where we really want to start to look at what's the long-term future for the sector? What are some of the challenges for those people who are operating businesses within the sector, and get a couple of different perspectives on the risk management, the financial management, and the reputational management of the sector. I'm delighted today to be joined by Lyle Steffensen, who is the practice leader at Marsh Care Solutions, and also Mark Harrison, who is a partner with Pitcher Partners in Melbourne, as well as my colleague and friend Karen Brown, who is the National Director of Cannings Purple. I might just hand over to you very briefly to introduce yourselves. Lyle, we might just start with you if we can.
Yes, so I'm actually I work in the wonderful world of insurance. I've been working in insurance for nearly 25 years now. I started when I was 12. And it's my area of focus is really on education, worship and care organisations. And we have a number of clients who are actually particularly involved with many of the COVID-19 issues right now, and also looking to plan ahead for post-recovery pandemic response planning. So I'm really looking forward to today's discussion.
Well, we'll flick over to Mark then, perhaps.
Apologies for that interruption. Morning, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'm a partner at Pitcher Partners in Melbourne, SME-focused practice servicing the middle market. I work within our business advisory and insurance division, which is a polite way of hiding the fact I'm an auditor a lot of my time for my sins. I work across a lot of our clients within our healthcare practice and also our not-for-profit practice, which hopefully means we've got a few insights into the world that all the attendees today live in. I've been doing this for over 30 years, I think now, so it's been an accumulation of knowledge and experience that hopefully we can share a bit of today, but obviously the learning curve over the last 10 weeks is probably something we haven't seen before. The impact on all sorts of businesses across our clients has been very significant. And so whether it was just from cash flow planning to getting our clients into JobKeeper and all sorts of things in between, it's been an interesting period with challenges for everyone, but hopefully most will get through this. Probably in a different shape to what they were, but hopefully they'll get through it.
Fantastic. And Karen, I'll hand over to yourself now.
Thank you very much, Ruth, and good morning, everyone. Thanks very much for joining us. My name's Karen Brown. I'm the National Director at Cannings Purple, which is just a fancy way of saying I do a little bit of everything, but the bulk of my practice is in crisis communications. I've actually spent a lot of time in recent years supporting clients through the Royal Commission process, from the Royal Commission into child sex abuse, through to the Royal Commission into aged care, and now the Royal Commission into disability services. So the crisis side of our business has obviously been very busy since the COVID-19 pandemic began, and we've worked across a range of really quite intriguing and interesting clients, but we've done a lot of work in this time in the health and the care sectors. So acutely aware of the impacts that the pandemic have had in terms of testing people's crisis response. And we're now turning our minds to how we can assist organisations going forward in terms of really putting some long-term planning into place and testing the responses and perhaps improving on the systems and procedures that they have in place. So looking forward to the discussion today.
Fantastic. And look, what I'd like to do is welcome anyone who has a question to use the chat function to add a question through. So they'll come through to me and I'll be able to ask them directly of the presenters either as we go or at the end of the conversation. And if you have any concerns or if you have any issues, please also pop them there and we can moderate those on the way through. Look, I wanted to not hit everybody with too many PowerPoint slides, but I just wanted to show two figures which I think are really stark about the kind of experience that we've got today that really frames this conversation. And so the first slide looks at, obviously, the Australian context of COVID-19 deaths by age group and sex. And I don't think this comes as a shock to anyone. The very high rates of mortality amongst over 70s and particularly over 80s. So it's a recognised issue in terms of the age. But I think what's perhaps more interesting is the next slide, which is looking at what that means in terms of the residential setting of those deaths. And if we could just pop to that next slide. That's fantastic. Thank you. This really shows how many of the 102 deaths that we've had in Australia actually occurred in the aged care sector. So 27 deaths of the 102 occurred within aged care homes, and then another small number occurred within in-home care. So those are obviously a substantial proportion of the deaths that's taken place, and it really focuses the attention on how aged care and care providers respond to a situation like this. So I would like to kick off with a question, perhaps to yourself, Lyle, around what you've seen in terms of the response planning to this crisis, and whether it's been swift enough, adequate enough, whether it's enough to reassure certainly your sector as an insurer, but also financiers around the risk approach of organisations.
I think it's been it's an industry that's obviously under stress, because with the Royal Commission, particularly into aged care, it's a very active commissioners. We've had the introduction of the aged care quality standards as well in July, and really what I think this has done is actually brought another challenge to an already challenged industry. The initial response to the Aged Care Royal Commission was one which was interesting, which was, we're doing a really good job and you're being naysayers, to now what feels like a much more dynamic, responsive community. And the response to COVID-19 has varied from, not really knowing what to do to being, excellently managed. So we've had a number of clients who very early on, particularly with the COVID-19, reach out to actually have us work with their board and with their risk committees on how to actually expand their continuity plans to include pandemic response planning, down to organizations who, were really struggling to even work out where they could get PPE from. So it's been a varied response. I think the benchmark standard has been organizations that actually have a holistic risk management approach. So the Department of Health, by all accounts, has actually focused specifically on infection control as a risk. And so all of their communication, and while that's been a very strong support to the industry, there has been very little focus on the other risks: governance risk, liability risk, communication risk. And so the work that, the organizations that have actually taken into account those other issues have really done well. One of the issues as well has been about workforce. With an industry that's already under pressure for finding people who can do the work, and then having people who are ill, because a lot of these cases that have happened, they've caught, residents have caught COVID from staff, and that really was a big problem, and it's still a problem about how do you get new staff in, when do you actually let them come back to work? And then the on-flowing effects of, the stress that causes to the staff members themselves. So I would think that, overall, I actually think the industry has done very well.
Fantastic. Mark, what's your take on the strategic planning of the sector? Have they been able to move quickly enough to look at whether or not they can survive financially through this process, adapt business models if required, or at least manage the short-term demands on extra funding for staff, expenses, things like that?
Oh, there's no doubt that they've responded extraordinarily well. I think clearly their foremost attention was directed at the clinical challenges that they've all had and keeping residents safe and then moving on to their staff. And those challenges are front and centre of every operator that I deal with and continue to be so. I think they're now also very much thinking about not only just core health, but the societal impact of what happens to isolated residents and the pressure on staff and their mental health as well. Like, it's a very unique situation that we obviously find ourselves in, and still relatively new, as much as it seems like we've been living like this for a very long time. If you step back to a financial perspective, which is almost secondary, but clearly becomes critical at some point. Rising cost structures have to be dealt with. The operational changes have had an impact, and that's going to flow straight to the bottom line of most operators, or it's going to see a rebalancing of services, retracting things that were otherwise done and maybe that can't be done in the current climate, or they just choose not to balance their books. The new challenge is also obviously lower revenue. There's clearly going to be a lower occupancy rate at the moment, as we see, certainly the people I speak to are seeing a lower propensity for people to become residents as spaces become available, and that occupancy rate is going to impact on the revenue, which then also filters through to the bottom line, combined with obviously a lot of operators have significant investment portfolios behind them. The lower returns there sort of compound obviously the operational challenges. So ultimately, it's squeezing the bottom line. In responding to that, there's two aspects. There's the short term, but then there's the longer term. You can cut some costs and try and balance it to work out how long you can provide and keep going with efficiency. But the challenge now, I think people's minds right now are turning to how long can they sustain a decrease in net surplus if there is one. And they need to continue to focus on those scenarios. And it can only be scenarios. There's no when this situation will live. That'd be the first impact to deal with that. I think most operators are aware of that clearly. They're acutely aware of managing their profit and cash flow. And then they've got to move that into their balance sheet impacts, lower investment portfolios, slower replacement of bonds or accommodation deposits, and how that impacts on their working capital situation or their general funding of their operations. And then from there, obviously, the thing that few people have probably thought about, there are no real answers. It's a strategic impact. And there's going to be winners and there's going to be losers from a strategic perspective in terms of people who stay in the sector and those who choose to leave this sector because either they can't meet increased clinical demands or the operating squeeze, cash flow squeeze, or ultimately they can't retain the confidence of their residents or their future residents as to being a safe place to be, which will also impact their strategic or their longer-term viability. So I think clinically doing a fabulous job, cash flow management, they're doing what they can. Funding, I think everyone's communicating well with funders. They've just got to now address the changes that may happen, and then the strategic questions still remain, I think.
I might come back to that question around where you see perhaps exits from the market. But first, I'd like to just look at that issue that you've raised there about perception. And Lyle, this is something that you touched on as well. We are off the back of the Royal Commission. There was a lot of question around where aged care sat in people's view. There's also been really a tug of war in this process where, on the one hand, operators were doing everything they can to keep their residents safe, but at the same time they were being criticised by some family members, and in some cases being criticised by government for being too restrictive. But in those cases where issues of COVID-19 emerged, they were criticised for not being restrictive enough. So there's really a perception challenge here. I'd like to ask you about that, but I'd also like to make sure that Karen can respond to that as well, from about how you manage some of those competing views and also the many stakeholders on the way through.
So I'll jump in first and then have Karen speak to the strategy for that. The organisations were very clear about what their focus was, did well. So one of our clients has had, a very high media profile. And they were unfortunate enough to have, deaths as a result of COVID within their facility. But because they were really clear about their strategy about supporting their residents and providing clear communication to them, they pretty much dealt with that in a way that, it was just impressive, because they actually produced a communication statement that they provided to their stakeholders, to their owners. They provided a communication statement that went to their insurers. They also communicated with their staff and internally into the organisation to the residents, just about why they were doing what they were doing and what was happening, with a real certainty and stability that left everyone feeling comfortable. And they never took their focus off their primary purpose, which was to provide a home for the residents in a way that actually allows them to feel safe. And so their position, based on what the federal government was doing compared to the state government, compared to the Department of Health and all these other people who, are giving advice about how you run an aged care facility, they kind of paid mind to that, but then focused on what their particular plan was. And I think that made a huge difference in terms of their reputation, their ability to maintain people within their company, their relationships with their staff, their relationships with the family members. And there actually was very little noise in the media about this particular organisation. So I think that's it's really key to focus on where you're wanting to go, who you are as an organisation, and sticking to that brief.
Fantastic. Karen, what about the many stakeholders you're having to manage at this point?
Yeah, look, just really endorse Lyle's observations in terms of, a sector that was really already under the pump as a result of the Royal Commission. And we've worked with a lot of organisations who'd put in an enormous amount of effort to prepare themselves to appear before the Commission. And then to have this task laid on top was, really quite a resource hit. But those, I would argue, from a reputation point of view, the actual sector has probably come through the experience in a fairly positive light. I think the example that Lyle gave of an organisation who had a really clear purpose, we saw play out in some of the media commentary, where there were politicians, there were family members, appealing to the media, appealing through the media to really put pressure on organisations. And many of them gave very, very clear and consistent messaging through the entire pandemic that their decisions were going to be clinically informed, they were going to put people's lives first, and they weren't going to buckle to that pressure. And I actually think in the long run, that's had a very positive impact in Australians' perceptions, not only on the way that the sector has handled this incredibly difficult task, but I think it's possibly also changed the perception of many Australians as to the really critical nature of the aged care sector. And while the Royal Commission was shining a light in a specific way, I think this pandemic might have actually, called people up a little bit around, actually, this is a genuinely critical sector in our community, and we need to make sure that it's properly funded and it's properly resourced. And I think, if there's any positive, out of the experience, it may well be the change of perception in the minds of many Australians, because I think many people looked at the way that many facilities handled what was an incredibly difficult situation and were full of praise. And to Lyle's point, those organisations that were consistent, were regular, were clear, but also had a mind to the multi-layers of stakeholders that they had to speak to. So, and that really went from the residents through the families, through, as Lyle said, the health department, the state governments, the federal governments, the local authorities, the local communities. There was an enormous amount of interest in the way that organisations were handling the situation, and that interest translates to pressure when it comes through a media lens. But I think those people who managed to maintain very regular communications have really come to understand the value of internal communications with stakeholders as a great strength in a crisis response.
Fantastic. And look, I would imagine that's likely to continue, Karen. That's going to be an ongoing issue, even as it perhaps drops from the media spotlight. There'll be a need to keep your staff engagement very high at this point.
Absolutely. And I think probably the only thing that changes in the weeks and months ahead is the rhythm. I think, lots of people that we've spoken to have really been, and this is not just in the aged care sector, this is across the board. They've really come to understand the power of information, and that when you share that information with your staff, when you share information with families, when you map clearly why you are doing things the way you are doing them, people are actually able to feel comfortable about the work and the way that it's being done. And while the frequency of those communications has inevitably slowed in recent times, I think there's still going to be a hunger for information, and that's something that we all experienced at the beginning of the pandemic. But there's now a level of reassurance that comes from that repeated engagement and that repeated supply of information that will be really critical to maintain confidence across the sector.
Fantastic. Well, look, Mark, I'd like to come back then to that question around where you might see some consolidation happening. And obviously some of that may be COVID related, but some of that may also have been in train and just put on hold out of the Royal Commission. Is that right?
Oh, there's no doubt that there is a investment hesitancy at the moment, as I guess investment markets take a watch and see whether it be on that's probably more on a third-party equity basis, whether it's private equity or IPO. Those transactions are certainly slow. I think there's probably greater propensity for operators in the space to continue to transact other than the last 10 weeks. I think the fundamentals of the sector haven't changed. We're still dealing with 101 million people in care, population in Australia that continues to age, and a revenue base of over $20 billion. So those fundamentals about business investment aren't going to change anytime soon. Obviously, it's still a very fragmented market, and I think that's what's always been driving the consolidation that we've seen over recent years, the aggregator models that we've seen. And I think that will continue. I think there probably will be an acceleration as some of the smaller players probably recognise the challenges of lack of scale of economy in dealing with crisis, the increase in outflow of requirements from the Royal Commission will wear people down, the talent war that's constant and the turnover of people will make it harder for smaller operators to sustain themselves. I think the interesting thing that we don't know the answer to will be strategically whether we see a greater shift or greater deferral of moving to residential and more home care, like a longer home care period, because of the hesitancy to go into residential care because of the associated contagion sort of issues, or whether we see a cultural change. There's other societies where elders of a family are cared for by family members, and perhaps that will be adopted here. And the other thing not to be discounted is that we're going to have a huge government deficit and budget challenge, and that's got to be paid for somehow. And so there will be budgetary response to the deficits being created at the moment as we steer our way through that. And whether that'll impact this sector. It's probably going to impact everything that's government funded, so that will meet possible changes in models. And then finally, technology. I think we've seen more accelerated rollouts of all sorts of technology in the last 10 weeks than programs that have been done previously. Programs that would have taken 6 months to roll out, people are doing overnight. So
yeah,
I think some of those barriers of technology adoption are probably going to get swept through a lot quicker. So I think they'll impact the underlying fundamentals and then probably the ability to do consolidation.
And now we actually have a question from one of the attendees, which is exactly to this point. What is the longer term strategic impact that the fear of having the virus in residential facilities might have on the increasing sentiment to at-home care? Now, this is something that's obviously been seen if we look at the UK and we also look at the US. There's been a sort of a slow trend away from campus-based aged care towards at-home care where possible. The logistics of at-home care, though, can be very complex, and the older you are, the more frail you are, the more different medical issues that you have, the harder that is to manage. Lyle, do you see there is an issue of liability here?
Yes, I think there's a couple of factors. I mean, one of the issues that created, I guess, a bit of a spread of COVID in one of the organisations deal with was a staff person that was working, sometimes home care and then in different facilities. So one person working in, 2 days this job, then this job, and then, goes and looks after a resident in their home. So logistically, that is the commonality for a lot of aged care providers, aged care staff. So the issues from a liability perspective is, they're threefold. I think one is about the actual person, the staff person's safety themselves. When they're actually in a home, like how do they actually navigate a residence compared to a facility that has been built specifically to cater for all of those health issues, and is a much less controlled environment than in a aged care home. So I think to Stephen's point, about the perception that being at home is safer, I think that's not necessarily true. There's a lot of other things, even things like, tree roots growing on the pavement, for example, and it's being a tripping hazard for the person who's entering the home. There's a whole, air conditioning. We know lots of, older people, particularly in summer, really struggle with not having, they overheat and they pass away. There's a whole raft of care issues that comes with actual residential care that is very different to a facility that's been designed and built to take care of all those, concerns. And I think COVID actually just adds an extra layer to that. So, some of the conversations that, we've been having with clients has been about, how do you ensure that a person who is working in different facilities actually continues to be safe? Do they then get rostered onto the single facility? Or do you just have people who actually work in home care with particular people only? And how do you manage, checking their temperature, and whether they're getting sick, all those things. So I think it's a very complex issue. I know that the government has really been pushing for people to stay at home, and they're pushing funding that way. I think it's going to need to be looked at again in order to, establish how these issues actually get dealt with from a risk.
Look, I think that's a really good segue into questions around sustainability, and I might just ask a couple of very quick ones, one each, about how we do have a sustainable workforce here, and some of that is at the board level, making sure that you have the consistency of governance, but also it's down to that workforce level as well. Mark, just in terms of the boards, there's obviously been a huge requirement for excellent governance and detailed governance and understanding of detailed operational practice. How well set up are the boards, do you think, for this, in particular in some of the smaller organisations or the not-for-profits? Do they have the depth of experience needed?
Oh, look, it'll be a it's a very diverse audience out there. I think there's no doubt that governance in not-for-profits and all organisations has improved tenfold in the last 5 to 10 years. I think it's certainly been one of the key developments that we've seen within the corporate sector, whether it be listed or otherwise. So I think that we're a lot better off than we were, but there's obviously always scope for improvement. I think that's where all boards need to place themselves now. While they've obviously got to get through the current crisis and manage their way through that, at the end of that, or whenever you feel you can return to some sort of normality or take a deep breath, I think the opportunity is then to do a self-assessment at a board level as to how you've gone and really look to improve or evolve the existing corporate governance structures. And some of the questions would be, were the safety responsibilities met? Were communications effective? Do the delegations of the board to the executive work effectively? And was the right information available for information decision, and was it on a timely basis? Some of those sorts of learnings will be really important then to evolve the board from a governance perspective. I think then from there, I think you've got to look at the new world that you live in and how that impacts on governance. I think the first thing would be to recognise, well, one, update your board on the regulatory changes. There's been a raft of legislation that's been passed recently in regards to board obligations and responsibility around reporting and disclosure and the like. I think you should obviously, while your memory's fresh, update your crisis playbook. You know, there's been a lot of learnings in the last 2 weeks. Let's not lose them. And corporate memories are short and change. So I think it's really important to grab those learnings for the next crisis, if there is one. Invariably there will be, hopefully not to the same degree. Then reset yourself for the new business as usual. If we're going to continue with remote working, how do you do effective management? How do you look after your staff? How do you have effective board meetings? And then I think the piece at a broader level, it's culture, and how do you maintain the organisation's culture, which is clearly the first responsibility of a board in terms of making sure that the tone from the top is then reflected in culture. And what is the strategy post-COVID? So risk assessment will have changed, and I think it's important to then take those learnings into the strategy policies and the immediate plans for all organisations.
Fantastic. Look, I'll just remind people that if they would like to put a question through in the chat, they're most welcome to. But while that's taking place, Lyle, this was always a sector where work was often fairly precariously held in the first place. You have on average an older workforce than in many other areas. You have a large degree of casualisation, perhaps English as a second language, or different backgrounds that perhaps don't have the same level of technology experience as well as infection control experience. What does that mean in terms of producing a workforce that can be sustained and reduces your liability overall as an organisation, that you've got the right people doing the right things?
I think there's been a lot of focus, both in the quality standards and in the commission about care of residents, the whole dignity of risk conversation. I think that equally applies to your staff. So those organisations that are actually relating to their staff as a valuable resource that is, if they don't get treated well, they'll leave and they'll go somewhere else. But it's a hotly contested issue about, what does a well-paid, well-remunerated aged care worker look like that sees this as a career. I mean, there's different levels of, I guess, clinical risk management. Obviously, you need nurses. Nurses haven't necessarily seen aged care as something that's, particularly cool. But there's an increasing, it seems, a profile that working in aged care really gives you job satisfaction, connection with people, and a long-term career. And I think the industry is actually really trying to work to encourage people to enter this as a career opportunity rather than, working somewhere part-time just because that's all that's available to you. I think the other side of it, when you talk about attracting staff, is that there's still a lot of problem in the industry with actually allowing people to be trained properly. So you've got your aged care, you've got nurses, obviously, who, do their qualifications, get support there. But then when you've got aged care workers who are doing a very short program to be able to get a qualification, and that's about all that's available to, employers that are looking for new staff. There's a whole piece around what additional education can be offered by the employer that will retain those staff on a longer term basis, and possibly non-dollar remuneration benefits, things like access to, life insurance plans, financial planning, retirement planning, or other things that actually help people live their life in a way that makes them feel happy and fulfilled. We know that most aged care workers are not in it for dollar. They do it because they love the people, they love the job, and they really care about it. And I think it's something that could be expanded more. I think to Mark's point about viability, because I think the three key risks about COVID, one is infection, one is viability, and then the other is I had my three and I forgot. I'll come back, but just in terms of viability, the organisations that are doing well and attracting staff are those that actually have that very clear, come and work for us. We will make sure that you get, the help you need to actually progress your career. Here's some training opportunities. We're able to get you a deal on your private health insurance, we can roster you at a place that's actually close to home for you. We know that if you're working 3 or 4 different jobs, we want to look with you about what that does in terms of managing with your family commitments. And I think that flexibility and creativity is now not just being called for, it's necessary in order to survive.
Fantastic. Look, we've got a quick question, which I think I might flick over to yourself, Karen, very briefly. So this is, I know you work a lot with boards in this area, but the increased pressures on and expectations of board members that come out of things like the Royal Commission, there's so much change taking place in funding models and other issues. How much do you see as a trend towards boards looking for this to be more of a professional role themselves, board remuneration rather than just traditionally voluntary?
It's a really interesting question, and I think some of the issues that Lyle has just walked through in terms of the risks, the increased risks in the wake of something like the COVID-19 pandemic, I think will be burning very brightly in the minds of many volunteer directors. And I sit myself on a number of not-for-profit boards, and I'm acutely aware of the fact that just because we're not for profit doesn't mean that my responsibilities are any less. And I think there's a real responsibility on the part of organisations to not only ensure that their staff are well trained in the way that Lyle's just discussed. I think there's a real responsibility to ensure that if you're going to have board members, that they are suitably equipped. And the boards who've responded well in times of crisis, and this is not just in COVID-19 land, but boards that respond well are boards that have the appropriate skill set sitting around the table to ensure that there is good, clear decision making. I think I think people will continue to step up and want to make a difference, but I don't doubt for a second that when people do their due diligence, they'll do it very thoroughly, and as they should. You should be very mindful stepping into these roles of what's involved. But I would hope, I would sincerely hope that people still want to make that contribution. Whether or not-for-profits are ever going to be in a position to pay board members is a fairly vexed question, particularly in a sector like aged care, where we've already discussed this morning the sort of challenges associated with the funding model. Their challenges around operational viability, whether or not the government can be convinced that actually funding good corporate governance is a critical part of funding the sector, may well be one of the advocacy steps that comes out of a crisis like this, because I think that is one of the next things that good boards should be doing, is looking to what did we learn and what should we be contributing to by way of advocacy across the sector for change that we think would make a difference and ensure that we do better next time.
Fantastic. Well, look, what I might just do as a final wrap up is to ask each of you where you think the attention of those boards should be in the next couple of months. We've obviously come out of the crisis period, but we're now into the next bit where those lessons are going to have to be cemented and learned. Mark, I might just start with you. What do you think is the most important approach at this moment?
I think I'd reiterate the earlier comments. I think the first thing to do is reflect on how well you've dealt with the crisis and what you need to reinforce or where the shortcomings that need to be bolstered are. And then I think obviously think about the strategic positioning and what the longer term looks like, and how you maintain yourself in the brave new world.
Fantastic. Lyle?
I agree. So the three things were business viability, your actual infection control response, and governance. Just funny because that's all we've been talking about. I don't know how I forgot that. But the thing about your risk response, the crisis risk response, the big difference I think with this pandemic and COVID-19 is how quickly you need to be able to change your pandemic response. Sometimes you have to do that on an hourly basis, and the flexibility of your plan. If I was to say to a board, the biggest thing you can do is make your plan usable and flexible and, intuitive. And a lot of the plans that I've seen have just been, say, picture perfect, but no one can actually use them because you don't know where to find stuff, and when you've got, a staff member's come in and said, I've got a sniffle and I'm concerned I might be sick, you need to know what to do pretty quickly. So I think that's the first thing is like your actual pandemic response piece needs to be reviewed very regularly. And I'm not saying every 2 weeks because I think your plan 2 weeks ago is too old. So that's possibly in the short term. I think that's the key thing. And there's lots of help for that. Department of Health is all over it. So, use it to death. The associations as well, like Laser, for example, have now set up bulk buy opportunities where you can get PPE and so on. They've got pandemic response hubs. Use the information that's there. So I'd say, be active and be informed. So then the second thing about the longer term business viability and governance, I think those are kind of heading into the post-pandemic response piece. So the business viability, because of what's happening with the Royal Commission, and the report has been delayed, but it was supposed to be out in October. And I wouldn't be surprised if the commissioners actually did produce the report in October. They're pretty active, so, and they move fast. So I think understanding what your business viability is, what your model is, and whether you're, going to want to put your hand up to be purchased by someone, have those hard conversations. Have them. Like, don't be afraid to have them. Because I think in the longer term, if you're not able to have a business model that is viable enough to sustain the next few years, then it's a good time to look at whether you want to continue as an organization. And then the third thing about governance particularly is, make sure your board is skilled. I agree with that entirely. Like the number of the boards that have done very well, the organizations, they've had skilled board members. They've been in the industry a long time. They've got a balance. A lot of the boards where things go a bit skew with is there's a big focus on clinical risk management and nothing on operational risk management. So, the business might be heading into insolvency, but they've got very good infection control. You need to be thinking about, where you're going as an organization, what is your plan? I know from an insurer's point of view, they're really concerned about long-term liability. As you well know, it takes 3 to 7 years for a liability claim to really flush out in the system. So that is a risk that isn't present now, but your actions now, you'll be paying for them in 7 years. So it's a really good idea to look at, what your plans are about how you operate now, because, but with a 7-year focus, Anyway, that's all I've got to say about that.
Well, it's a really good point, and Karen, it sums up nicely. I know that issue around wargaming different scenarios was something that we saw with a lot of different organisations as we were trying to guess where this might go. How important do you see those kinds of conversations going forward?
Critical, and I think Lyle's point about having you can have a crisis response plan that sits neatly in a digital file somewhere, and everyone feels warm and fuzzy that we've got this covered. But the reality is that if you haven't done the scenario planning, if you haven't actually tested how do we speak to our staff, how can we contact 300 families every 3 hours, and do we have the systems to support that? I mean, I think I completely endorse the comments made by both Mark and Lyle. I guess my take from a communications point of view would be to observe that lots of organisations have implemented incredible change in the last 3 months in the platforms that they use to communicate with not only their staff, but their residents and families and stakeholders. Now's a great opportunity to embed that change. We talked to a lot of organisations at the outset who said, oh, well, we do briefings face to face. Well, that's not possible anymore. They have shifted very, very quickly, as the rest of the world has, to a new normal on digital platforms and a really broad range of digital platforms. We've helped clients with everything from webinars like this through to podcasts for their staff, through to live chat rooms for their staff. There's a whole range of ways that providers can actually look now to really test their methods of communication, to say, are they fit for purpose? Are they as engaging as they can be? And now that we've actually introduced FaceTime calls or Zoom calls with families, is that something that we can actually embed into our permanent practice? Is that something that we can offer? Not just because there's a relative who can't come in the front door, but actually there's a relative, in London who would really love to have a call with their mum once a week. We know now that we can actually do this. We can have the technology and we can embed that. So I would really be looking for the opportunities that come to sort of reset the way that we do the communications. And I guess finally, I'd also look to the opportunities for advocacy from a government point of view. I think it's too late in 3 months' time to let the dust settle and say, okay, well, wouldn't it have been great if we had X, Y, and Z? The government and the political opportunity is now going to, at an advocacy level and at an industry level, speaking to the government now while they're most responsive and the experience is still very raw and very fresh in their minds. Now's actually the time to have those conversations. So I think they'd be the two things for me, really assessing those crisis plans and the way you communicate, ensuring that that rhythm is frequent and regular, ensuring that your tone is still what it needs to be, empathetic and caring and supportive, but being very clear in the messages that you deliver and really looking, I guess, to the positive opportunities that might come in the wake of the pandemic.
Fantastic.
Can I just add, I just want to add one little thing to that. I think Karen's absolutely right. And one thing I want to add is just how many older people have adjusted to learning the technology is astounding to me. I mean, I'm in a choir where, our oldest member is 76 and, she could barely manage her phone. And now she's actually on Zoom with us. And, she's always muting and unmuting herself and doing all weird and wonderful things, but she's there, and it's taken the 12 weeks of COVID to get her onto Zoom. But that is the experience for lots of people. And they want to be engaged with their family. And I think the technology platform, I mean, what a wonderful way to actually move forward.
And it also I think it's a great point, Lyle. The other final reflection, Ruth, is that it might not just be in technology; it might be in behaviours. So one of the things that we've seen is many all care homes actually requiring people to show an influenza certificate to show that they've been vaccinated before they're allowed in. Now that may become standard practice across care homes. Providers actually might say, you know what, that had an incredibly dramatic impact on the health of our residents, and we're going to make that something that we're going to ask all of our families to do from now on. They're the sorts of opportunities that I think we need to be alive to.
Yeah. And that's a fantastic positive note, I think, to wrap up today. I'm really delighted to have had the conversation. I hope you've enjoyed it as well, as those who have attended. I'd really like to thank Lyle Steffensen and Mark Harrison, and obviously yourself, Karen. And what I'll do is I'll make available to people who've signed up for this. We've got a couple of links that might be of value, and that go both back to Marsh and to Pitcher Partners and to ourselves. But thank you very much for joining, and we hope to speak to you all again soon.